afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name's Scott Kearney, and I'll be the chair for today's session. I'm an associate professor of cognitive neuroscience in the Department of Psychology at the University of York, and I'm also the science faculty lead for the Institute of Mental Health Research at York. My research is primarily focused on the role of sleep in cognition and mental health, and I'm particularly interested in how sleep helps us to remember and forget. So I was absolutely delighted to be offered the opportunity to chair today's talk. But before I introduce today's speaker, I just need to go over a few technical points. The first of which concerns subtitles. These are available for today's event, so to turn these on or off, you can just use the CC Show Captions button at the bottom of your screen. Should you have any technical issues, such as a loss of Wi-Fi, you can just rejoin the event using the original link. If you are watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen. This is available throughout the event, so questions can be posted at any time, and questions will come to at the end in a Q&A session with the speaker. Please also remember that today's event is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it again as many times as you like. And please also tell your friends so that they can watch it too. So at this point, I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce today's speaker, Professor Charan Ranganath, who is the director of the Memory and Plasticity Program and a professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of California at Davis in the United States. He is also the director of the University of California's Dynamic Memory Lab, a world-leading research laboratory that has made numerous important discoveries about the mechanisms in the brain that allow us to remember past events and how these mechanisms break down in people with memory disorders such as Alzheimer's disease. Charan truly is a world-leading authority in the field of memory, and his work has been recognized with numerous prestigious awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship and the Leverhulme Fellowship at the University of Cambridge. I was fortunate enough to see Charan give a plenary lecture at the International Learning and Memory Conference last year, and I must say that I found his talk to be incredibly thought-provoking and engaging. The same can be said about Charan's new book, entitled Why We Remember, The Science of Memory and How It Shapes Us, which will be the focus of his talk today. It's fair to say that Charan's new book really does turn what we think we know about memory on its head. Although many of us think about forgetting as an annoying bug in our memory systems, Charan makes a clear and compelling case that our brains are designed to forget things so that we're best prepared to navigate the challenges in an uncertain future. So I'm absolutely delighted that Charan has joined us today to talk about his new book and his world-leading research on memory and forgetting. And I'd like to hand over to him now so that he can give his talk. Please take it away, Charan.
Thank you, Scott, for that kind, generous introduction. And I want to thank also the organizers of the festival for having me and everyone out there who's listening. So let's go ahead and get started. I often find that even as a memory researcher, even as somebody who's written this book, I often kick myself for forgetting, and I think we all do. Most people I meet, when I tell them I study memory, the first thing they usually say is, can you help me? I have a terrible memory. I found this meme on the internet, and I actually used it as the opening quote in my book because I think it summarizes some of the modern condition that we have, where we end up remembering the inane sometimes at the expense of the important. And so we ask ourselves, why is it that we can't remember the way that we should? And why do we forget so much? Well, the fact of the matter is that, in fact, forgetting is the default function of the brain. And what I mean by that is if you go back to the earliest quantified study of memory by Hermann Ebbinghaus. So he was a researcher in Germany. He actually studied himself and he tried to memorize these meaningless words. And then he would see how long it would take for him to forget this information, or rather how much he could retain this information over time. And what he found was within about 20 minutes after learning, he had already lost 40% of the information he learned. Within an hour, he was at about half of what he had learned. And then within a few days, he had only retained about 1/5 of what he had learned. So if you take this data and you consider the fact that all studies of memory that look at forgetting pretty much show this kind of a steep drop off in how we remember, how much we remember over time, what it tells you is that we will forget the majority of our life experiences. Now, when I say that, I'm talking about the details. But nonetheless, if you think about the fact that you're losing so much information, the question isn't why we forget so much, but rather why do we remember anything in the first place if the default is to forget? To start off with, I think it's helpful to understand at least the working idea of how memories work in the brain. So we don't basically the brain is it consists of a whole lot of cells called neurons, and these are pictures of two neurons, and this is a cartoon. But basically what you can see in this picture is these neurons have a long protrusion called an axon, and then these little things that come off the sides that would be dendrites. And basically the dendrites and the axons are how the communication takes place. And without getting into super details, what we know is that these little areas of connection, so to speak, between different neurons called the synapse can change over the course of learning. And that change can allow information that we experience to become stabilized in memory. So, for instance, if you were to meet me and see me on the street and I introduced myself, what we would expect is that there would be a set of neurons in the brain that might be active when you meet me and you hear my name. And that act of being co-activated, amongst other things, would allow these neurons to become more strongly connected with each other. So that later on, if you were to see me, if you activated even some of these neurons through these connections, they could activate the remaining neurons and give you a sense of remembering. Now, that's the theory anyway. Now, the problem is that in practice, memories compete with each other. We have a limited number of neurons, but we have to encode many, many memories over our lifetime. So if you see me on the street later on, ideally, if you activated these neurons, you might be able to recognize my face. But say if you happen to see someone else previously, and you saw this guy, for instance, from the movie RRR, who actually shares one of my names anyway, the actor, what you might find is that there's competition between this face and name that you previously learned and this face of me that you've just discovered. And so that competition basically makes it harder to activate the memory that you're looking for. So it's this competition that drives most everyday forgetting. And so if you think about the things that you forget the most, like your glasses or people's names or keys or where you put your phone, all of these things are hard to remember because you have so many competing memories that could be candidates for where you put these things. So in other words, you've not just put your phone in one place, you've put your phone in many places. You put your keys in many places over your lifetime. And so you have all these competing memories that are blocking access to the one that you need, which is where did I put my memory? I'm sorry, where did I put my keys 5 minutes ago? So what determines memorability? What determines whether or not an event will be remembered? Well, there's a few key principles. One is importance. And what I mean by this is, well, I'll tell you what I mean by each of these things, but we can talk about importance, distinctiveness, meaning, context, and error. So let's walk through these factors. So let's think about importance first of all. So when I'm speaking of importance, often that importance is not necessarily what you think is important at the time, but what your brain is prioritized, basically. So if you think about the moments that we remember most in our life, they tend to be associated with strong emotions. That is, emotions like fear, excitement, desire, attachment or love, surprise, or curiosity. And it's these emotional states that are associated with the release of chemicals in our brain called neuromodulators, things like dopamine and serotonin and noradrenaline, cortisol. These are chemicals that you might have heard of. And they change both the way that we see an event in real time And also they modulate plasticity, meaning that they allow for the strengthening of connections between the neurons that are active during an event. And that's what allows us to remember these events later on. So distinctiveness is another factor. And what I mean by that is, I was telling you before that distinctiveness, I mean, that memories compete with each other. And so if you have memories that are distinct from the other ones, they have less overlap from other memories in certain ways, those details can make one event stand out from another, right? So I've got this as an example. This is actually AI generated, but it's a picture of something that schematically looks a little bit like my desk. And you can see here on this desk, it's crowded with all of these yellow Post-it notes. And so if you had written a note on one of these Post-its, you'd find it very hard to find that note later on. But if you wrote it on one of the pink Post-it notes, which I've shown here in the center, it would be easy to find because it stands out from the rest of the notes on your cluttered desk. And the same is true in memory. That is, that our brains are cluttered with memories. And the more one memory stands out from the rest, the easier it will be to find later on. Another factor is meaning, which is the relationship between what you have to learn and what you already know. So if you look at people who are chess grandmasters, for instance, what you find is that they have lots and lots of knowledge about the game of chess. A grandmaster has seen numerous chess matches and can watch a chess match and then within minutes remember the entire sequence of moves and reproduce them. So chess masters have an incredible ability to remember information within the domain of chess because they can reduce what they need to learn by buttressing what they're trying to remember with the things that they already know before. They can match up every complex pattern they see on a board with something that they've seen in their lifetime. Likewise, to a professional basketball player, when they're seeing a series of moves unfold on the court, they're matching it up with memories for things that they've seen in real time. And they can take a complex set of activities that's moving extraordinarily fast in space and time and reduce it into a clean, simple, distinctive memory. So another factor that determines memorability is context. So by context, I mean that there are parts of an event that serve as the background. They're the tapestry on which we lay down new memories. And if you have cues that are going to uniquely link up to that background, that context, that can bring you back to a specific time in your life. So, for instance, I visited the town of Seattle recently to visit my daughter, Mira. And when I was there, I saw the skyline from the plane. And seeing that skyline brought back memories of a trip that I took to Seattle when I was in college. This is something that often happens is being in a place can vividly bring back memories. But it's not only that. If I listen to Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, for instance, it'll remind me of my first date with my current wife. Likewise, anyone who's seen the movie Ratatouille will remember the scene where a food critic who's extraordinarily angry will suddenly see this and smell this dish that he had had during his childhood, and it brought him back in time to a point where his mother used to make him his favorite dish. So these are the kinds of cues that bring back memories for us, the songs, the places, and the smells, because they uniquely allow us to access a particular time in our life. And finally, I'm going to talk about something called error. And this might seem to be a weird one, right? Why would error be related to success in remembering? And our computational models of the brain suggest that error actually gives your brain a critical chance to patch up memories and make them leaner and meaner so that you can access them later. So, for instance, if you see me later on and you're struggling to activate that right set of neurons that's going to give you my name, and then later on, what happens is I tell you my name. Well, now you can delete the bad connections in that memory and strengthen the good connections of that memory so that later on you're more likely to activate the right memory and separate it out from the competition. Now, it turns out that almost any time we struggle to remember something, that actually turns out to be something that can actually give us better learning in the long run. So if you're trying to study for an exam, the best way to study for an exam is to test yourself. If you're trying to memorize words in a foreign language, it's good to actually try to guess the definition of the word even before you get the definition. But research shows that just that act of struggling to try to pull up the right memory, when you actually get the information you're trying to learn, it will be better remembered. So that's a little bit on the how of memory. But why do we remember in the first place? And what I mean by that is memory is about the past, right? Or at least that's how we think of it, that it's about the past. But the past is over. So from an evolutionary perspective, you've survived the past, and there's not really that much of a reason to keep everything from our past, right? Just like you wouldn't keep everything that you've ever encountered and hoard it all into your house, or hopefully you don't. You keep the stuff that you need. And memory is designed the same way. One of my big influences in thinking about memory was actually someone who didn't study memory formally. This was Dr. Danny Kahneman, who famously won the Nobel Prize in economics, and he wrote the book Thinking Fast and Slow. And this is a quote that I love from Danny, which is, he said, memories are all we get to keep from our experience of living. And the only perspective that we can adopt as we think about our lives is that of the remembering self. So he basically said we have two people in our heads. One is the self that actually experiences life, but that experiencing self only comes out every now and then. And when we're making decisions and we're doing the consequential things in our life, it's actually the remembering self that is the part of us that has access to memories that's calling the shots and making the big decisions. And we now know, in fact, that if you look at scans of people's brains while they recollect events, like this is one from my former postdoc, Maureen Ritchie, who's now a professor at Boston University, or Boston College, I'm sorry. This is a scan of areas of the brain that are active when people remember past events. Now, this is a scan of people's brains showing areas in the same network that are basically involved in being able to understand a story or a movie in the present. And these are the areas of the brain that light up when people are trying to predict or imagine or simulate how the future could go. And as you can see, both lay people and memory researchers would have trouble telling you the difference from just looking at a map of the brain as to what's going on, whether somebody's in the past, the present, or the future. And the reason is we use the machinery of memory to understand the past and to plan and simulate the future. In fact, one of the greatest memory researchers of all time, who was at the University of Cambridge, Sir Frederick Bartlett, argued that the act of remembering, just like the act of imagining, the act of remembering is just like the act of imagining, that we don't replay the past, but we imagine how the past could have been, which is why he called it an imaginative reconstruction. So this brings up the question, can we even trust our memories if they're acts of imagination? Well, if we're imagining what could have happened, we could also imagine those things wrong. And in fact, we can see this happening in real life all the time. So this is someone who might not be so familiar to audiences in the UK, but this is a journalist named Brian Williams. And so he was a major newscaster in the United States. And he was in an incident while he was reporting in Iraq where he was in a helicopter flying over a combat zone. And he reported that the helicopter ahead of him in the convoy was almost blown out of the sky. Now, 10 years later, he had gone on a speaking tour and was telling this story over and over again to people on talk shows, to people in media interviews, and so forth. And what he would say is that two helicopters were hit by ground fire, including the one that he was in at the time. So he went from basically remembering this event accurately, that one helicopter was taken down, to grossly inaccurately, where he remembered essentially him being in the helicopter when it went down. And so a lot of veterans in the US were mad about this because they felt that he was actually stealing their story. But if you think about it, when you remember an event, if you're trying to put together the pieces, sometimes you can put them together incorrectly. Sometimes people will end up putting them together in a way that might make them look more heroic or more courageous or more clever. And this is probably what happened to Brian Williams. And this is why I say that memory is not like a photograph, it's more like a painting. In that essentially, if you look at photographs and you look at paintings, they share some characteristics. So this is actually a beautiful painting by Vincent van Gogh of a building, a church in France. And what you can see is that this painting actually captures some realistic aspects of the church. So, for instance, there's something that resembles the clock here. There's a little windows here that match up some of the features of this actual church. But then there are some embellishments that are also inaccurate. So, for instance, this is a little protrusion that comes out that you don't see in the real church. And there are also some parts of the painting that are neither true nor false, but they reflect the artist's unique perspective on the world, like the coloring in the background of this church. And so when we construct memories, they're in essence like these works of art. They reflect parts of our experiences that happen, and then they reflect parts of our experiences that might be filled in ways that could be a little bit inaccurate. But on average, we tend to remember the gist of our experiences pretty well. So one question that I get a lot is, well, that's all fine, but I can't remember things as well as I used to. In fact, some people will say, I feel like I'm becoming dumber. And memory does, in fact, get worse as you get older, but the story is not quite what you think. This has gotten a lot of attention in the United States recently because our president, Joe Biden, is the oldest president in American history. And we also know that there is a competing candidate, Donald Trump, who's also very old, only a few years younger than Biden. And so there's a lot of hand-wringing about this in our country. And in fact, I wrote even an editorial about this topic in the New York Times. And some of what people are worried about reflects some misconceptions with age. So what we know is that on average, memory declines with age. So what I'm showing you here is kind of a complicated graph, and I apologize for that, but it actually is kind of a simple message. Each of these studies reflects the average of one group analysis comparing memory across different age groups and looking at memory performance over the lifespan. And what you can see is if you just look at the average, that essentially as people get older, which age is shown on the x-axis, memory, which is plotted on the y-axis, tends to go down. And in fact, it goes down quite precipitously on average. But what happens if you track individuals? Well, what I'm showing you here on the right are graphs of, I'm sorry, I'm not a morning person and it's a little early for me this morning. Let me go backwards. Not all forms of memory tend to decline with age. What you tend to find is that our knowledge about the world, the facts that we've learned in school over time, for instance, or the things that we've read about and can recite as our common knowledge, that tends to actually improve with age, if anything. It definitely does not get worse, at least remains stable. And if you track individuals, what you'll find is that the picture is more complicated than saying simply that episodic memory, that ability to form new memories for events, declines over age. What you tend to see is that on average, again, this is a plot of a bunch of individuals shown in gray who are tracked over time. And so each of these lines represents one person. And if you plot the average, yeah, you'll find that memory declines over time. But if you look at certain individuals, what you find is some show a very large decline over time. Shown here in red, these are two of the individuals who are tracked in this experiment. And here's another couple of people who were tracked who showed either stability of memory over time or even an increase in memory over time. So we know that quite a bit of people show what we would call successful aging, retaining the same amount or even improved memory over a long period of time. These estimates vary widely. It may be something like about 1 in 10, but nonetheless, those are people who exist. So we know that, in fact, many people can age well. Now, as we get older, a lot of the forgetting that we experience isn't necessarily losing the memory, but rather not being able to find the memory that we have when we need it. So, for instance, if I were to see Scott again in the future, I might be like, wait, what's your name? I remember seeing you. I remember that we met, but I might not be able to find it at the time, perhaps because I've activated the wrong name. And so as a result, I'd have trouble finding the right name. And that's something that happens. Or sometimes what can happen is you just get stressed because you can't recall the name immediately. And that stress shuts down your prefrontal cortex, an area of the brain that controls these executive functions, these functions that you need to find the information in memory when you need it. And so then later on, you can recall this information. I might bang my head and say, of course, it's Scott. But at the time, I didn't remember it because it just wasn't accessible to me. So if you're finding yourself not being able to find information when you need it as you get older, that's what I would call a lowercase forgetting. It's not anything to worry about. So not being able to remember what specifically you talked about in a conversation would be lowercase f forgetting. But on the other hand, if you had no memory of having had a conversation that happened quite recently, that would be capital F forgetting, and that would be the kind of forgetting I'd be more worried about. So a region that plays a starring role in our everyday forgetting is an area called the prefrontal cortex. And this is the area, as I said, that supports executive functions that help us tune out distractions, to call in strategies that we can use to remember better, and to catch it when we make mistakes in memory. Now, the problem is that there are a lot of maladies of everyday life that block these functions. So when we're stressed, for instance, that can downregulate the prefrontal cortex and make it hard to remember information that we previously learned. Likewise, we often shoot ourselves in the foot by multitasking, which would be, for instance, if I were to be checking test messages amidst trying to do this talk, I might not remember this talk later on because I'm constantly using my executive functions to switch back and forth between text messaging and giving this talk. Fatigue, as Scott can tell you better than anyone, is another factor, and insomnia, and we subject ourselves to this all the time. And lots of great work on sleep deprivation have shown that it's absolutely horrible for memory formation. Illness is another one. We're seeing a bout of people for right now with long COVID, and people will often write me saying that they suffer from this kind of a tragic brain fog. And this brain fog they have is very real. And you can see this in other conditions too, things like chemotherapy. You can see this actually in people with chronic fatigue syndrome. And the data is showing that these inflammatory effects can be quite bad. And depression is another memory blocker that people don't often know too much about. In my clinical experience, I've tested people who are older adults who didn't appear to have the symptoms of Alzheimer's, but their memory looked much, much worse than you'd find in someone in the early stages of Alzheimer's because they were so depressed that they could not function in the real world. So another thing that I'm often asked is, how can I improve my memory? And usually people want some kind of a drug, they want a food, they want to be able to do Sudoku, or they want to take some vitamin to be able to improve their memory. Now, there's lots of people who'll sell you products that might or might not do that. But there are some low-hanging fruit out there that you can use to improve your memory and help you maintain better brain health over the course of age. This is a study that I really love. It's a very recent study that was conducted in China on 29,000 people over the course of 10 years. And they just looked at a very crude set of factors, 6 factors: not smoking or drinking, maintaining what they called cognitive activity, social contact, physical exercise, and a healthy diet. Now, these aren't extreme forms of lifestyle changes, but just basic forms of changes. And they just quantified how many factors these people had going for them. And what they found was at the beginning of this study, in 2009, people who had an unfavorable profile of health and people who had a favorable profile of health looked more or less the same in their memory performance. And that's shown on the y-axis here. And this is, again, a very crude measure of memory. And what they did was they followed these people over time and tested them again and again. And just to make this very clear, if you actually track the people who are favorable over time, and I'm showing you that with this purple line, and you track the people who live the unfavorable lifestyle over time, and that's shown in the red line, there's a dramatic difference between them. They're actually doing almost twice as well at the end of the study as people who are in the unfavorable condition. Not quite twice as well, but almost. Now, if I could tell you, hey, there's a drug that you can take and it has some crappy side effects, but you can maintain much more of your mental health, your cognitive health over the course of 10 years, you might be tempted to take it. But now if you think about factors like healthy diet, physical exercise, social contact, etc., these are things that not only can help you maintain your brain health, but also maintain your physical health and improve your mental health as well. So I'd really encourage people to go for these low-hanging fruit, these activities that can improve your life right now as well as into old age. So people often ask, okay, that's fine, but how can I improve my memory? So I just want to leave you with a few quick take-home messages. So one is, what I like people to think about is to remember better, not more. Now, what's remembering better mean? Well, if you start off by the assumption that you're not supposed to remember everything, then you can prioritize what matters. And what I mean by this is we walk into the world with the assumption that memory should be easy and that we should just be able to automatically record everything we experience. But that's just not true. And I can teach you strategies for being able to memorize names. I can teach you strategies for remembering where you put your keys and so on, finding your way around a new town that you're trying to form a mental map of. But these strategies aren't going to help you if you don't use them. And using them requires some intention to prioritize whatever is important to you to be able to remember. The second thing I'll tell you is remember more by memorizing less. And what I mean is you have a lot of prior knowledge, and you can use that to reduce and organize what you have to learn. And finally, remember more by giving yourself the chance to forget. If there are things that you really need to remember, like a name, like a word in a new language, like a face, challenge yourself by attempting to recall that information in different contexts, and then give yourself the reminder afterwards. And that'll be a good way for you to be able to strengthen the memories that you really want to access later on. So the big takeaway, though, that I want you to have from this talk is that memory is not about the past. The past is gone. It's over. The use of memory is really to make sense of the present and to allow us to anticipate and make choices to give us a better future. So the question I want to leave you with is, what are the memories that you want to carry with you into the future? And I think that's a philosophy of life that you can use to make decisions that will give you better mental health in the long run. So I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Charan. That was a really fascinating and fantastic talk. I enjoyed it a great deal. Thanks very much. At this point, I'd just like to encourage people to keep popping your questions in the Q&A, and we'll come to these one by one. Hopefully we'll have time to get through all of them. We've got around about 25 minutes of a Q&A period. So yeah, please pop your questions in and we'll go through them. The first question that we have actually is a really interesting point about remembering random things from a while ago that we may not have anticipated that we'd need in the future. So the question is that if you're able to recall things from a while ago that you never set out to remember, might that suggest that the brain is capable of remembering everything?
Well, there's a big controversy about that. I think you can find memory researchers who will say absolutely not. We don't remember most of what we've experienced. And then you'll find researchers who will say that, yes, you remember almost everything, and that, in fact, it's just a matter of not being able to find it when you need it. The truth is probably somewhere in between, that we have many more memories than we can access at a given moment. And yet we probably don't remember everything. We don't remember every detail of what we experience, in part because we can't even pay attention to everything we're experiencing. In fact, our brain gives us the illusion that we're seeing everything right in front of us. But in fact, we actually see a small fraction of what's in front of us, and we use memory to fill in the blanks and give us a picture of what's going on. And so as a result, we're really missing a lot of the details in life. And I would argue that you're going to have some random memories for things that you might not have intended to recall, but you're also going to be missing a lot, and there's going to be events and experiences that you have that just disappear.
Great, thank you. So the next question is from Susan, and Susan asks about what's happening when you remember something that you've been struggling to remember several hours later when you're no longer thinking about it. And maybe that speaks to the point you're making about stress and prefrontal cortex.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So let's go back to this concept of that memories compete with each other, right? So if you go into this ecosystem of memories and they're competing with each other, and let's say you pull up the wrong piece of information, well, what happens is that now that piece, that memory that you accidentally pulled up, is now really strong, and it's suppressing all the other memories that you could be activating. So as a result, the memory that you're trying to activate is now at a severe disadvantage. And so even though you know it's there somewhere, you have trouble finding it because, temporarily speaking, it's been handicapped by the one that you've actually accidentally pulled up. Now, another factor, as we brought up, is stress, because the more that happens, the more stressed out you get. And that basically shuts down your prefrontal cortex. And actually, research has shown that when people can successfully overcome that state of having something at the tip of your tongue, you recruit the prefrontal cortex to do it. And so those two factors can really wreak havoc on you. But when you're in a new context, and those competing memories have had a chance to sort of cool down, you're in much more of a better state to be able to recall the information that you're looking for.
Great, thank you. So the next question relates to severely deficient autobiographical memory. And the person asking the question asks how this compares to the uppercase forgetting that you talked about, the worrying kind of forgetting.
That's an interesting question. So, just to give people a sense, one of the big questions, and I think this is true of a lot of psychology and certainly in neuroscience, is we don't have a great understanding of how people differ in memory. And one of the facts that's become very clear is there's a lot of individual differences. There's some people who have what's called highly superior autobiographical memory, or hyperthemia. And those are people who can remember the most specific detail from something that happened years ago, and they can actually put a date on when this thing happened and put a time on it. So they have this extraordinarily detailed memory for their lives. Then there's people with severely deficient autobiographical memory who don't seem to have any ability to relive their past. And to the extent that they can remember a past event, it's often like something that they've read in a story. So what makes these people different? Well, we don't know. But what's fascinating is that it turns out that probably many of these differences reflect a peculiar kind of memory, which is autobiographical memory. It's memory for life events that we've experienced. Many people with severely deficient autobiographical memory can still do great in school. They have this capability to memorize just fine and acquire knowledge, but they don't seem to remember where that knowledge came from. People with highly superior autobiographical memory, if you give them a bunch of meaningless, arbitrary stuff to remember, they'll do no better than anyone who has what you'd call a normal, typical memory. So it seems like severely deficient autobiographical memory is not characterized by that scary form of forgetting as much as you're just pulling out different information from your experiences than somebody with superior autobiographical memory.
Awesome, thank you. So I've got another interesting question from David, who his question relates to the fact that although that we have these various mechanisms in our brain that help us remember the important things and the things that have meaning and that are distinct, why is it that people still sometimes manage to forget important things, such as giving birth or getting married in this example? But David says, or is that just my friends and I?
Well, there's a bunch of possible explanations for that. It turns out, actually, just as in relation to giving birth, what you find is that there's this phenomenon called baby brain, where women who've just given birth report having like just this kind of a brain fog, and in fact, it is associated with mild memory deficits, so it's a real thing. But that's not speaking to the question that this listener is giving. I guess we don't know what makes some, it's very hard to reverse engineer specific memories, but often what it is that you remember that it happened, but you just can't re-experience it, and you can't remember the details of it. You have the gist, but not the specifics. And so sometimes what it takes to recollect those events is to be back in that context. And so we've talked about how being in a particular place. So maybe if you were back in the room where the birth took place, you'd be able to recollect that event more acutely. So that's just one example. Or if you're back in the place where you had your first date, you might remember that in a way that you wouldn't before. Likewise, songs, as I've said, can be a powerful trigger for memory, for experiences that people didn't realize that they had in there. So sometimes you just need the right context cue to pull up the memory.
Great. So our next question from Charlie, and I think this is a big question in relation to the content of your book, Charan. So, how does selective memory about our past impact how we view the future?
Oh, that's a really interesting and difficult question. That's one of the rare questions I've never been asked before. I think it actually it can have a very big impact. And the reason for that is that sometimes we overdo the importance of memory. So we all saw this during the COVID pandemic, where somebody might have heard about a person who had a bad reaction to a shot. Let's say somebody had a vaccine and they had a terrible reaction, and it resulted in a very lurid story that was printed in all the newspapers. Well, for some people who read that story, they might go, well, I'm not going to get a COVID shot because it puts me at major risk and I'm going to have all these side effects. But what they're not seeing is the broader set of statistics, which is that the chance of dying from COVID could have been much larger than the chance of having an adverse reaction to a vaccine. And so as a result, a lot of people ended up making an extraordinarily bad decision, at least from a medical standpoint, based on the selectivity of memory. And so that's why it's important to pull up memories from diverse sources and not just to rely on narrow sources of media to make your decisions. Because what happens is if you make your memories more selective than they should be, you're going to be more likely to be biased and make bad decisions.
Great. So yeah, really fascinating answer. Thank you. The next question is from Maggie, and Maggie asks how the menopause affects memory.
This is a really good question, and we don't know for sure. This is something I've become quite passionate about, is women's health, and the fact that menopause affects half or over half of the population. And we don't know much about what happens in the brain or the cognitive effects of menopause. There is some data to suggest that memory does decline with menopause. Now, there's also some data, and it's pretty controversial, but there is some data to suggest that women who get hormone replacement therapy while they are transitioning to menopause can actually show better retention of their cognitive abilities and not show the same levels of memory loss, and that it can have a neuroprotective effect. Now, I'm not a doctor, but if you are in that camp, you should definitely talk to your doctor about that, and they can give you a much more informed idea. But I would love it if we knew much more about women's health and the brain, because it's a very important topic.
Indeed, thank you. The next question from Ian is actually, he touches on a similar thought that I had during the talk about eyewitness testimony. And you made the really, I think, nice analogy about the painting and a photo between, our memories and reality. And, given the fragility of memory, to what extent we can really trust eyewitness testimony. Ian asks about what research indicates about the strength of eyewitness testimony based on people's memories.
Yeah, it's actually very interesting, because what we're learning is that the answer turns out to be somewhat complicated, and like many scientific questions, it depends. So let's take the most obvious example, which is you've witnessed a crime and now you're asked to point out the perpetrator amongst a series of mugshots. What the research tends to show is the first time someone's looking at these mugshots, if they say, that's the person, I'm absolutely sure, then that tends to be a correct answer. And if they say they're not sure, at that point, you can't trust the person's testimony anymore. Now, what happens in a lot of criminal situations is they say, I think it's this person. So then the witness is brought back to do another lineup, and they go, yes, I'm sure it's that person. And what can happen is that you get confused between your actual experience of the crime and your memory for having seen this person's face in the mugshot book. And there are all sorts of cases like that where people's memory has become corrupted, because the act of trying to remember something can produce a memory in and of itself. And so when we try to remember something, we can imagine how things could have been. We might have some weak sense of familiarity, but the next time around, we pull up that memory by accident, and we can confuse these things that we imagine and these things that we saw in one context and put it together in a story in another context. So if somebody is saying, I'm, from the get-go, this is the exact person who perpetrated the crime and I'm sure of it, that's usually a sign that they remember it very well. One exception of it is if people are trying to identify a stranger and that stranger is of a different race. And it turns out that people are much worse at remembering individual faces of people from different races than from their own race. So that's another area where you don't necessarily want to trust eyewitness testimony. And finally, just in general, eyewitnesses tend to get the gist of these events correctly, but they tend to get the details wrong. And so sometimes you can have a very vivid memory for having witnessed a car accident or having witnessed a murder that took place, but you don't necessarily remember the details so well. But sometimes that confidence can spread from the things that you know well to the things that you didn't know well. So you remember that the event happened, and therefore you must have remembered that he was wearing green shoes.
Awesome, thanks. So we've got, I see that there's two questions that are quite similar, just in relation to advice for preparing for exams. So it looks like one has maybe come from a student and another has come from a teacher looking for advice for their students studying for A-levels. So what advice, Charan, could you give for the best way for people to commit information to memory when they're preparing for exams?
Well, one of the weird things about memory research is that it reveals some of the perverse incentives that we give kids in school So we will often have people study for months and then give them one big test at the end of term to decide whether or not that they've learned the material. And it turns out that in some cases, the optimal way to perform on those tests is to wait till the night before. Make sure you get a good night's sleep. Basically, wait till the night before and try to cram as much into your head as you can. And then the next morning, you'll be able to remember it because it just happened a short time ago. So that mental context is easily accessible. But what you find is 1 week after the exam, people forget all of this information. So the better way to learn information so that it sticks and you can retain it and access that information easily is to do regular testing, regular quizzes, or even if you're studying, space out your studying. Don't wait till the night before, but try to keep up with the material as it's coming in and revisit that material regularly over time. And so spacing out your study and testing yourself, these are two tried and true ways of retaining the information you've learned over time. And this is why I would actually like education to shift its emphasis from using teaching as a tool for evaluating people and more as an educational tool for training people to learn and normalizing the idea that, yeah, it's okay to perform badly on a test because you will learn more through challenging yourself than you will if you just read this piece of paper and you think that you're memorizing everything.
Great. So the next question comes from someone with the famous initials in terms of memory of HM, and they're a teacher who currently teach 16 to 19-year-olds in psychology. And they say that we still teach Endel Tolding's 3 types of long-term memory: episodic, semantic, and procedural. The question is, to what extent are these ideas still used in contemporary psychology, and how outdated are they, if outdated at all?
They are definitely used in contemporary psychology, and I appreciate the question. It's always good to see where the field is moving. I would say that right now, a lot of researchers are debating about the relationship between episodic memory, which is your memory for events, and semantic memory, which is your knowledge about facts of the world. Um, and then procedural memories, these are these skills that you learn, things like riding a bicycle. So when you get on a bicycle, you don't remember what was I doing the last time I rode a bike. You just ride. And so that's a kind of a skill that you can learn. And I think the problem is that you can pull these apart in the lab. I can do experiments that really nicely tease apart episodic memory and semantic memory. And we know some areas like the hippocampus are very important for episodic memory, but not as important for semantic memory. Now, other areas of the brain might be quite essential for procedural memory, but not so much for episodic memory. But what we're discovering is in real life, everything's much more connected than that. And I think this is the theme that's really becoming important right now. So, for instance, if I go to a wedding, I have schemas or knowledge about what happens at wedding. And so that's the infrastructure on which you build an episodic memory for this new wedding that I've been to. Likewise, there's a lot of work. I mean, actually, I think, Scott, I'd love to ask you about this, but there's a lot of work suggesting that the circuitry for episodic memory plays a role in the consolidation of procedural memories. Isn't that true during sleep anyway?
Yeah, there's certainly some suggestion that there's an interaction between these memory systems, and that sleep may facilitate that. And the one thing sleep may be doing is integrating episodic memories in such a way that they might become more useful as procedural representations. So sort of stripping away that episodicness to the events that we encounter throughout the day. So, if we're practicing something for the first time, we might have quite an episodic memory of that practice, but it becomes more procedural and more automatic, and it's thought that sleep is involved in that process. And yeah, there is another question on sleep next, so we can we can get more into that one then. Awesome. So one just before the sleep question, though, we had one on a really interesting question from Katrina, And Katrina asks about whether there are studies about memory loss after concussion, and the extent to which memory returns after concussion.
That is something I don't know enough about. There is memory loss after concussion. What tends to happen is with many concussions, the brain sort of bounces around in the skull, and that has two effects. One is when the brain's hitting the skull, you actually get damage from the direct impact. And so that tends to affect the frontal lobes or the prefrontal cortex, and it affects the temporal lobes, these areas in the brain that were lost in patient HM and essential for episodic memory. So that is a direct effect. But then on top of it, what can happen is the brain can shift around. And if you imagine some jello and you sort of tip the top of the jello, what can happen is the top moves, but the bottom stays still. And so that's a kind of an effect that happens in the brain when you have a concussion. And that can shear, it can cut the white matter in the brain. And the white matter are these fibers that basically connect different brain areas together. And the prefrontal cortex especially tends to suffer from that white matter damage. And so it's not only that you have damage to the prefrontal cortex, but then on top of it, you have this inability for the prefrontal cortex to talk to other areas of the brain. So it's like you have this executive that's supposed to be running the company, but you lock it up in Siberia and you don't give the executive internet access. Well, he's not going to be able to lead the company. And so a lot of what happens in concussion is this loss of frontal function, especially that is really bad, both for memory, but also for decision making and just attention and functioning in the real world.
Great, thank you. So just coming back to sleep, Ian asks, what happens to memory of the day's events during sleep?
Well, so this is a question that you know much more about than I do, Scott. I want to just rewind. There's one thing I didn't say about concussion, which is that there is a lot of return of function within the first 2 years of brain injuries. Having a previous brain injury makes it harder to recover from concussions or other new brain injuries. But in general, there's a lot of recovery that takes place. There's rehab methods that are being used that show some promise in improving recovery, but it's still very complicated. I'm sorry, but yeah, now we can get back to sleep. And I almost feel like I shouldn't even try to answer this question. I should just give it to you.
Well, I'm sure you'd give a great answer, but yeah, I'm happy to take this one. So, what sleep is doing is helping us to strengthen our memories for the long term, so that they become more resistant to interference and decay. And we've known for a long time, actually, even for 100 years now, the first empirical demonstration of this was back in 1924, that if you sleep after you learn information, you will remember it better than if you remain awake. And that's because sleep is facilitating a process of memory consolidation, whereby your memories are just gradually strengthened and stabilized in the brain. Now, for a long time, people just assumed that this was a passive process, so that it was simply the absence of the kind of interference that you get during wakefulness, those various interactions that you have with other people that would disrupt your memory, that is benefiting that consolidation process. So people viewed this as a passive process. But research in the past 15 or 20 years has actually demonstrated that there are active processes going on in sleep that support memory processing in a way that the waking brain just simply can't achieve. That there are particular unique neurochemical and neuroactive patterns in the brain during sleep that that promote memory processing. And there are a bunch of different ideas about why this happens, but one of the key ideas is that memories are reactivated during sleep. And this reactivation is what strengthens memories so that they can be better remembered and better integrated with the information that we already have within our semantic knowledge. And this speaks to the point that we were making earlier about the integration between episodic and procedural memory. It's that process of reactivation that's thought to facilitate that. So sleep's doing a lot for your memory. You should definitely do it. It's a good way to remember things better. So how long have we got? I think we've maybe got time for 2 more questions. The penultimate question is it possible to differentiate between a real memory and a fake memory? And maybe that's just getting at the point of, are there techniques we can use in the lab where we can sort of determine whether something is more of a false memory than a veridical one?
Yeah. And as I was saying in my talk, in some ways, what we would call false memories are actually pieced together from true memories. So often when people have a memory for something that is incorrect, it's not because they have a phantom memory per se, as much as they've constructed a memory from other bits and pieces of experiences that they've had, which makes it very hard to tell the difference between reality or lived experience and things that we've just thought about or things that we've heard, and makes us vulnerable to misinformation. My former advisor, Marcia Johnson, did beautiful research on this topic, and actually John Simons at the University of Cambridge is doing some work on this too. And the basic idea is that there's two ingredients to helping inoculate yourself from false memories and misinformation. One is being, first of all, just making the effort to try to be accurate. And often we don't do that. We do things we make decisions about memory in a hurry, and we don't actually take pause to consider whether we're remembering everything accurately. But the second thing is you want to try to focus on the details. It's not just about remembering that something happened, but focus on the details of things that would have made sense only if they happened in the real world. So for instance, if you're somebody who can experience memories visually, try to recall the visual details of that experience. How vivid is it visually? How much can you recall the smells and the sounds as well of a memory? And those details are part of our lived experiences. They're not going to be as prominent for things that we've imagined or thought about.
Great, thank you. And we've got time for just one last question. Apologies to other people who haven't had their questions answered. We've just had too many. But I like this last question. It's a really cool one. And it's, is it possible to have a photographic memory? And how does this process differ chemically from an average person?
Well, most memory researchers, myself included, would say that there's no scientific evidence for photographic memory. What we know is, and as I was saying, we know way too little about how people differ in their memory abilities. There are documented cases of people, Stephen Wiltshire in the UK is one, who is a so-called memory savant. So he, for instance, could be in a helicopter, fly over a city that he's never seen before, and then not only recall the mental map of the city, but actually be able to produce it in these extraordinarily detailed paintings. Now, even in Wiltshire's case, those paintings have some details omitted and some details that are not accurate. So it's not the case that it's perfectly photographic, but it's very realistic and very faithful to the subject. Now, the two factors, one thing that we know is when people have such extraordinary memory capabilities, they tend to be in a narrow area. So people who have highly superior autobiographical memories are not necessarily superior at memorizing arbitrary facts. Someone like Stephen Wiltshire might not have a photographic memory for names of people that he met. I don't know, but I'm guessing that's true. So these tend to be in narrow domains where people have a lot of interest and they focus their attention in particular ways. And maybe they have a high degree of interest and motivation, and expertise as well can play a big role, as we mentioned with things like chess experts or basketball experts. As far as neurochemically what's going on, we don't know. If there's interest involved, then probably dopamine is a neuromodulator that plays a role in consolidating memories for things that we're interested in and making us more curious and focusing our attention. But we don't really know all that much. And even just saying it's dopamine and hand waving isn't really answering the question.
Okay, so at this point, I'd just like to thank you again, Charan, for giving up your time to come and give such a fascinating and thought-provoking talk. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for coming along and asking such fantastic questions. I just want to give you all a reminder that this event has been recorded and you'll be able to watch it again through the York Festival of Ideas YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival. And you'll also be contacted again by email once this is ready to view. And finally, if you would like to purchase a copy of Charan's book, which is again entitled Why We Remember, the Science of Memory and How It Shapes Us, that's available from York Festival of Ideas' partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books, which you can find at foxlanebooks.co.uk. So with that, I'd just like to thank you all again for joining what's been a really fantastic event. Thank you.
Thank you.